Welcome to Hometown Heroes. This is Rick Irving with my co-host Mary Staffel, and we're coming to you live today from a cold, frigid Texas. We aren't used to having the ice and the snow.
Not at all.
Mary is used to it because she's from Chicago.
Still
Today
not
we're
used to it. Still, I haven't lived there in a long, long time. This stuff is a nightmare out here.
today we're
Mm.
absolutely thrilled to have Ian Sanders, uh, Cold War Cold War conversation podcaster, and he's coming to us from England. So, welcome to Hometown Heroes.
Well, thank you, Rick and Mary. It's slightly warmer in the UK. It's balmy 6 degrees centigrade. Not sure what that is in Fahrenheit, but Manchester is very much famed for its rain. And we've had a lot of rain lately, but not the snow that you've had. That's crazy stuff.
It is crazy,
It's
and
more ice than snow. That's what I see going outside. I haven't left the house since Friday night.
me neither.
Mhm.
Well, Ian, just tell us a little bit about where you're from and how you got involved in the Cold War history.
Okay, so I'm originally from London. I now live in Manchester. And I started Cold War conversations in 2018. And it's primarily an oral history of the Cold War. So it's veterans, civilians, spies, astronauts telling their stories in their voices. And I think it's really important to get to hear it in the voice of the person who experienced it. It's fine reading it in a book, but I think it loses impact unless you're hearing it from that person. Now, I started this because I became aware that there was a lot of focus on World War II, and quite rightly so. But again, a lot of the veteran stories were not captured, on tape or recorded, apart from maybe written accounts. And my father served in World War II. And before he died, I recorded an interview with him. And that interview, I didn't know it at the time, but that was probably the genesis of Cold War conversations. Because I thought, that there's lots of veterans out there whose stories have never been told, that I can record, and maybe people will listen to them. And I thought I'd get maybe, a few hundred people listening to it. And little did I know that 7 years later, it's about 100,000 downloads a month, and it's now had almost 6 million downloads in total. Um, and it's now become a vast archive. I've been doing episodes without fail since March 2018. I haven't missed a week. And so there's about 436 episodes there. It's not all oral histories. I interview authors, academics who've studied the period. If there's a film coming out, I might do an interview with, one of the stars or something like that. So it's quite a varied collection there. But as I said, primarily it's an oral history of the Cold War.
You have a lot of people from Europe who were affected by the Cold War uh, on your podcast. So, from all the countries that have been impacted by that, I guess the whole world's been impacted by the Cold War, but especially in Europe.
Yeah, I mean, one area I'm always drawn to is East Germany. I'm always fascinated by the division of Germany, and also particularly the division of Berlin. I mean, trying to imagine a city split in half by a wall on the basis of ideology is difficult to imagine. I was lucky enough to get to Berlin in '89 before the wall came down, and before really any anybody had any idea that East Germany was going to effectively disappear off the map. So I did see it there, and I was extremely grateful that I saw it. I could see those I could cross through checkpoint Charlie, and I can vividly remember the experience of doing that crossing, even though it was a long time ago. But I have a number of accounts from people who live in East Germany, people who escaped over the wall or under the wire, people who lived there were unable to escape but describe their experiences, surveillance by the Stasi, the East German secret police, but also about their regular lives, where they lived, how they worked, who their friends were. Because regular life goes on. It's not all, spy drama or Stasi surveillance, but there's some particularly poignant episodes. One of the ones that I did, I think about a year and a half ago, was with a woman called Kirsten, and she was a young girl in the 1980s, and she was a promising gymnast. Now, what the East Germans were doing were feeding their athletes and gymnasts with drugs to improve their performance. She and her parents had no idea that what she was being given were drugs. She was told they were vitamins. Her parents took the word of her coach that this is what they were. But at some point, the East German government decided that Kirsten wasn't really good enough to make Olympic standard, and basically just said, "We're no longer going to be coaching you. It's the end of your career in gymnastics." And at the age she was, her whole life revolved around that sport. So suddenly she's off these drugs, but she suffers severe psychological difficulties, with problems at school. Her mother divorces. Um, it's a really sad and incredible story, but she does recover. She does, she marries, she's still with the guy she married. It's a lovely ending to it, but it sort of illustrates the extremes that some of these governments were prepared to go in terms of trying to show their strength and power to other nations, particularly in the sporting area. So that's one example of a civilian experience, an extreme one there. I've interviewed a number of people who served in the East German army, and those are really interesting conversations. I interviewed a guy called Dag, who was East German tank commander of T-72, and he talked about his experiences there. And I did a later episode with him where I had him chatting with two guys who served in the British Army on the Chieftain tank. And it was great because I just pressed the record button and then they just chatted about, so what was the food like? And we think the Chieftain was better than the T-72. And he's saying, well, some way, this conversation going to and fro. And what was interesting is he now works at the effectively the British National Tank Museum in the UK at Bovington down in Dorset. So he's seen the Chieftain and he drives their T-72 when they display it. So he's back in his old job of driving and managing T-72s. But that was a fascinating experience. But that sort of illustrates some of the fantastic conversations that I have the privilege of listening to.
And the East Germans, whenever the wall came down, they were able to enjoy a lot more freedom than they had.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they were able to travel. That was one of the big issues that East German citizens had about the regime, being unable to travel outside of the Warsaw Pact. They could go to Hungary, they could go to Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, but not further afield. And that was one of the big challenges. It's interesting when you talk to some East German civilians, because they did have a very high level of social security in their country. As long as you didn't stick your head above the parapet and criticize the regime and just kept your head down, you had free childcare, you had free university education, you had that safety net. But what became apparent in the late 80s is that the East German government could no longer finance that. They were in massive debt to the West. They'd borrowed loads of money from the West. And even if the wall hadn't opened in 89, East Germany would have probably imploded pretty soon after because of the economic pressures on it.
When did the wall go up? I don't remember what year it went up.
August 1961.
Okay.
So up until that point in West Berlin, so I'm sure most of your listeners will be aware, but Berlin was divided in two between East and West Berlin. But Berlin was situated about 100 miles inside East Germany. So West Berlin was an island in the middle of West Germany, occupied by the British, the French, the US, British, French, and US. So there were troops in there. But prior to the wall going up, you could travel relatively easily between East and West Berlin. So prior to 1961, a lot of East German civilians were getting out of the country through that sort of leak in, the wall that was around, the whole country. The East German West German border was equally difficult to get over, but then once the wall was put up, very few people escaped, and obviously, if you did try and escape and were caught crossing the wall, you could get shot by the border guards. In fact, I managed to interview an East German border guard about his experiences, and he was a conscript border guard. So, and he said, "Look, I didn't want to be a border guard." And so inevitably the question is, so if you'd seen somebody crossing the wall, would you have shot at them? And he said, well, our instructions were to fire shots, warning shots, first of all. And if they still didn't halt, then to fire at their legs. But, it's not particularly scientific. If you're firing a weapon, there's a good chance you might hit something on the person, which is going to kill them. I did another interview which was with somebody else, but they talked about an experience where they had a teacher who'd been conscripted into the border guards and then had come back to their school, and the students knew that he'd been a border guard, and somebody in the class very daringly asked him, what was it like being a border guard? And as a follow-up question, they asked, did you shoot anybody? And this teacher who'd been the border guard, he answered, I didn't need to shoot anybody. I just had to pull back the cock the weapon on the AK-47 and they would stop, because at night that sound would carry and the person would know that the next thing that was going to happen is they were going to hear shots. So you get incredible detail and incredible stories like that, interviewing people, just letting them talk. I mean, that wasn't a prompted question. It just sort of came out in the flow of the conversation you were having with them. And that's, again, one of the things I find incredible about what I'm lucky enough to experience is, in some occasions, it's the first time that person has thought about that in 40 odd years. And so you're getting it uncensored and pretty raw as well.
And there were people that got killed trying to go over the wall or through the wall, weren't there?
Yes. Yeah. I think it's in the hundreds across the Berlin Wall, the inner German border. I'm not sure of the number on that, but yeah, absolutely, people were shot dead escaping.
Because sometime after 61, when it went up, I was just a child, probably 9, 10 years old. And I can remember going to the laundromat with my mother, and there was some Life magazines, and I would like to thumb through the Life magazines. And there was a story about the wall. And it did show, the guards and a car that they had shot up. And it just left an impression on me that that's bad whenever people get killed trying to escape like that. So,
Yeah, I mean, the images of the wall without doubt leave an impression, and it's the thing that people most sort of remember about Cold War Berlin. I think what people don't always realize is there was more than one wall. So there was the wall that faced West Berlin, but behind that there would have been maybe another. Well, there would definitely be the death strip, another wall, and probably barbed wire and barriers there. So it wasn't so simple. And if you were trying to cross somewhere like the Czechoslovak West German border, there would be many kilometers of different barriers there. And at one point in Czechoslovakia, they'd set up a mock fence with all the signage indicating that the person who reached that and got over it was reaching West Germany, to trick people into thinking they'd actually escaped, and then they would capture them on
mm,
the other side. Imagine psychologically experiencing that. You think, great, I've made it. I've seen that West German border sign and I'm through. I'm free. And these Czech border cards suddenly appear out of the bushes and say, no, you're not.
it's terrible. The other Eastern Bloc countries, you've interviewed a lot of people that were in those countries, and a lot of them had suffered, you know, from different occupations and different governments and things like that. What are some of the people that really stood out in your mind on some of the podcast?
Um, I think one of them that always stands out for me is I interviewed a woman called Carmen Bugan, who was from Romania, and she described coming home from school, age 12, to her home. Her parents weren't there, and the Romanian secret police were tearing the house apart. And you can imagine a 12-year-old girl turning up and finding these big blokes just ripping the house apart and telling her she can't go in. Um, and it turned out that her father had gone on a one-man protest to Bucharest to protest against Nicolae Ceausescu, who was the Romanian communist leader, and he'd been arrested. And Carmen tells how her family are allowed to live in the house, but only in 2 rooms of it. The rest of them are all sealed off. It's under intense surveillance with microphones. Her neighbors aren't allowed to um, talk, talk to her. Um, and at that point, they think their father's dead. And then they're told that her father is alive. And the way that she describes um, her first visit to her father, aged 13, and only she alone is allowed to visit. Her mother isn't allowed to come with her, or a relative isn't allowed to come with her. So imagine a 13-year-old child going to visit her father in a high security prison, and she just doesn't recognize him when she sees him. His head's been shaved, he's lost a huge amount of weight, and they almost just don't know what to say to each other, because the father knows how much impact he must have had on his family by doing this protest. He knew there was going to be repercussions there, but he still carries on with them. The story ends on a positive note. They do manage to eventually get a visa to emigrate to the United States, and they now live. Carmen lives in the United States, but that was a really powerful story, and one that I didn't really expect the directions it was gonna go in there. Um, Others I've interviewed, people from Poland who had sort of a very different Cold War experience to some other countries, because in Poland, the Catholic Church was a very powerful force, and the communists knew that they couldn't completely suppress it. So it was almost like a third force within um, Poland, and you'll probably remember when Pope John Paul was elected the Pope, and he was Polish, and he came on his first visit to Poland, and there were just million or over a million in some of the crowds there. Absolutely phenomenal crowds. And this was when he visited, was around the time of Solidarity, the free trade union being formed in Gdansk. So there again, Poland was in a similar situation to East Germany. It'd taken out massive loans with the West, was unable to pay them, and were having to put up food prices. And putting up the food prices caused strikes. Strikes were illegal, but some of the workers formed a free trade union called Solidarity. And in the end, the Polish government had to make an agreement with this free trade union because they were just stopping the country from working. And then 10 years later, the communists hold semi-free elections. Solidarity wins all the seats that were available to them. And, Poland is probably the first domino within the Warsaw Pact to fall to democracy. And it's an incredible story. But I mean, I was lucky enough to visit both Czechoslovakia and Poland in the early 1980s, and I was in Poland in September 1980. So this is 1 month after Solidarity had been allowed to exist by the communist government. And I remember us sort of looking in the hotel car park each morning to see whether there were Russian tanks parked there, because they were expecting a Soviet invasion to put down, this trade union, because that's what had happened in Czechoslovakia in 1968, where a communist government decided they wanted to liberalize, and the Soviet Union and the other countries of the Warsaw Pact decided that they didn't want them to do that. And Hungary 56 is a similar situation where the Soviets came in and invaded.
And
And I just want to tell you a story about a Hungarian interview I did, which I found particularly fascinating, and it gives an indication as to how I find some of these guests. So I was scrolling through Twitter, X, well, it was called Twitter then, and that's where I often find guests on there. But there was somebody had just posted that, and this was during the COVID period. It said, "This is my dad's last beer before lockdown, and 70 years ago he was storming the radio station in Budapest." So I immediately realized that her father had been a freedom fighter in Budapest in 1956. So I messaged her and said, "Look, I'd really like to chat with him. He's a rare eyewitness, and I'd like to capture his story." So I did a lovely interview with her and him. I could hear the wine glasses chinking there, so it was a nicely oiled conversation. He'd ended up in Wales, in the UK. He'd managed to get out and end up in Wales, so he had this lovely Welsh Hungarian accent. But what had happened is in 1956 he was getting the tram home from work. The tram had stopped because of the uprising, and he was, you know, told, was handed a submachine gun and told, "Look, we're going to go and try and get into the radio station to take that over." And he gave quite a graphic description of his experiences in that assault on the in the radio station in Budapest, and told the story of the rest of his life. And one of the interesting things about this was his daughter at the end of the interview said to me, "He has told you things that I have never heard before. He's told us about this stuff, but the things that he was saying, we have never heard this before." And I think that's the benefit of having like a neutral interviewer doing the interview, is that, people get relaxed, or maybe the wine helped. I don't know. But it was a beautiful beautiful interview. It's one of the ones I really enjoyed, as I'm enjoying this one as well.
And that's something we hear often with the veterans that speak at roll call or the ones that are on our podcast, is their families say, we didn't know all this stuff. This is the first time they had opened up, and it's so important because it's kind of therapeutic for those people to kind of get down deep and expose some of the things that happened to them and their experiences that their family didn't even know.
Yeah, I'm finding that more and more is that either families or the person themselves wants to share their story while there's still time to share that story. I've had a few occasions, the most recent one where I did the interview and the guest had a stroke, I think about a week later, and his wife wrote a lovely message to me just saying it was so nice to hear his voice, as he was laughing and joking and telling his stories. It's unexpected. I mean, when I'd started this, I thought it was just going to be telling stories, but it becomes very powerful when you hear, you're allowed into this sort of the intimacy of hearing some of these tales of these people, and to get a note like that, it's uh, you know it really does bring a lump to the throat.
Yeah, yeah, we've had similar experiences where we have one of our roll call members, Chuck Hodge, who will go and he'll spend as many hours as it takes to capture as much of the story as he possibly can with a veteran. And we've had multiple times where the veteran then passes and this disc that he created is not working, and so the family wants to get a duplicate, and he has those, and he gives them, and he doesn't charge them a penny, and it's all just about preserving that history for the family like you're talking about. And I saw him at the lunch on Friday, and he was out looking for other people to capture their stories as he does every single luncheon. But I think what you're doing is absolutely so valuable, because how many people learn about the Cold War? And I was born in '60, so I'm in that era where we, at least in school, we were learning about things that we weren't living that happened before. But today, these students don't learn this. They have no idea. When you say Cold War, they have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. I mean, um, last year the podcast got featured in the New York Times, and there was a brilliant quote in there, and I just quickly read it out to you. The quote was, it said, "Listening to even one episode of Cold War Conversations will make this sprawling, potentially intimidating period of history feel vivid and compelling."
Mhm.
Um, and I could have written that better really as a promo, but I think yeah, the Cold War is an underestimated period because the term Cold War implies that nobody was killed. Yet we've already spoken about Korea.
Right.
Over 1 million civilians killed in that war. You've obviously got Vietnam, but you've also got the proxy wars that were around the world, like the civil wars in Angola, where the Cubans were on one side, the South Africans were on the other side, and Nicaragua with the Sandinistas. And the other day, I couldn't believe it. Daniel Ortega is still the president of Nicaragua, and he was, their Cold War leader. I know he's gone through various incarnations, but it's forgotten. It is a complex period, and I think listening to personal accounts does make it more accessible. I think particularly for students, because they can understand you know, being part of a family and being, they've never experienced what happened in East Germany, but they can understand those dynamics and how those dynamics work. And I've got a number of universities and loads of teachers that have contacted me saying they found Cold War conversations really useful as a sort of entry point for students into the labyrinth that is Cold War history.
Yeah, I don't think they're learning it a lot from reading a history book. Young people today, I think, are learning more from hearing and from seeing. And, they're all into the short videos. So when you can give them a short snippets here and there, and then they pick up on something that they get interested in, then they go dig deeper. But you got to first get them interested. And, my part one of my military service, because everyone that knows me knows I have a part one and a part two, was 78 to 86. So and there was a lot of stuff going on, and people don't realize how much stuff was going on. But it wasn't like we were all sitting around thinking that the world was looking great and there was peace everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, I think that 1983 period is particularly interesting because you've got a number of military exercises going on that could very easily have been misunderstood by a very paranoid Soviet leadership, an exceptionally paranoid Soviet leadership during that period, as implying that the US or NATO was going to attack them. But you've also got some near misses there. You've got the Soviet missile commander who's faced with an alert that says that there is 2 missiles being fired at the Soviet Union. And his orders are to contact the high command if anything like this happens. But he decides this can't be real. The US would never launch just 2. If they were going to attack us, they'd launch everything at us. And lo and behold, it turns out it is an error, and that the Soviet satellites are picking up, I think, sunlight reflecting on clouds, which to the satellites appear to be missile launches, or it's something bizarre like that. But you've got, near misses like that. I think the classic one is where it's during, I think it's Nixon's presidency, where Brzezinski, who was, I think he was in charge of defense or something, he gets a call late at night from NORAD saying, "It looks like we've got a Soviet attack on the way. What do you want me to do?" And he says, "I need you to double check and call me back as soon as you've double checked." So he puts the phone down and he decides not to wake up his wife because he thinks, if this is a nuclear attack on Washington and other countries, I'm in Washington, it's better that she continues to sleep and we both die together than to wake her up and have the experience that he's having is, oh my God, is this the end of it? But again, another incredible story, and a story that I think a lot of people aren't aware of.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we don't realize how fragile our world is. It could only take the wrong, missile, or just like that guy the Russian that thought 2 missiles were coming in. It only takes a deal like that to trigger total nuclear war.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's other situations. There's the one in the Cuban Missile Crisis with where the U.S. Navy wasn't aware that the Soviet submarines were armed with nuclear torpedoes, and in order to get these submarines to surface, the U.S. Navy are dropping training depth charges. Now, to a submariner, apparently, the sound of one of those going off is not hugely dissimilar to the real thing. And so the one of these Soviet submarine commanders thinks that war's started and that he should be launching his nuclear torpedo, but it has to be okayed by 3 people within the submarine, and one of the 3 refuses to okay it. I think he's Vasily Arkhipov, I think is his name. And they don't launch. But that's another really close near miss that could have had incalculable consequences. I mean, in 1960s, the nuclear arsenals were not as huge as the 1980s, but even so, it would have been pretty cataclysmic to the world.
Absolutely. What are some of the you've had some interviews with KGB people? How were those interviews?
They're interesting. They're very interesting. I think probably my two favorite ones is I interviewed Jack Barsky, which some of your viewers might be familiar with. But if you've ever watched the TV series The Americans, that's very loosely based on what he was intending to do in the US. So he was an illegal. He had was born in East Germany, was recruited by the KGB and trained to come to the US as an American. So he's given a Canadian passport. He crosses over, manages to get US identification, and he's a bike courier for a while, but then ends up working in a software firm. He decides that he quite likes it in the US and doesn't want to go back to the Soviet Union. So the KGB tell him that he needs to return. But what he does is he tells the KGB he's got AIDS. And in the 1980s, AIDS was like a death sentence. It wasn't a curable disease. And so they think he's deceased, but he carries on living in the US, and he's only revealed in, I think, the 1990s when a KGB archivist goes over to the British with all his information and comes up with this name, and he's arrested by the FBI. And he's obviously not been working for the KGB for about 10 years. He's just carrying on as a normal life. But when I interviewed him, it was incredible what he was having to deal with, because he was married to an East German, and he would visit her periodically from the US. He would travel via other countries and see her. He'd married a US citizen at the same time. So he's carrying these two secrets, as well as the secret of him being a KGB spy with his colleagues. And he said that, the psychological strain of trying to live those secrets was massive. But the other KGB interview that I particularly remember was with a woman called Svetlana Tumanov, and her family had emigrated from the Soviet Union. They were Jewish refuseniks, had emigrated from the Soviet Union, and she'd ended up in London, aged 18, and managed to get a job with the BBC in their Foreign Services department. And while she's there, she meets the head of Radio Liberty, which was a CIA-funded station broadcasting to Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. She falls in love with the guy, sells her flat in London, moves with him out to Munich, where he's based. And about 2 weeks after the marriage, he says, "I need to tell you something." So they go out onto the balcony of the flat, and she thinks it's a bit weird. Well, why are we going out onto the balcony? And he says, "I've been working for the KGB for the last 10 years." So she's got this quandary as to whether she turns him in. She loves it, she's fallen madly in love with him. If she turns him in, she is then on her own in West Germany, and she knows the reach of the KGB, and she's worrying about being killed or something like that with them. So she decides to help her husband, and she ends up getting a job teaching Russian to US diplomats that are going to be deployed in Eastern Europe. So she's passing this information to the KGB. Eventually, her husband gets wind that the West German intelligence services are onto him, so he runs off to Moscow and leaves her behind.
Mm.
And so she's left behind. She's arrested. She's in jail for a while. But what she manages to do is make contact with the KGB, and they invite her to meet with her in East Berlin to try and organize how she's going to get out. And she goes to this East Berlin meeting. There's 3 guys there. And so that's the first meeting with them. The second meeting, there's 2 guys there. And she says, well, where's the third guy? And they said, oh, his wife's just had a baby. He's unavailable. So she thinks nothing of this. And eventually she does get back to Russia, but she's in not great finances. She's, virtually homeless and living on people's sofas and stuff like that. But one evening on TV, she sees a face on TV that she recognizes, which is the face of the third guy whose wife was having a baby. And it's Vladimir Putin. So she then makes contact with Putin's office to say, look, I am the wife of a KGB veteran. I need help. And within, I think, a couple of weeks or something, she's offered a flat in Moscow. And it was the most incredible story. Just, you as you can tell, I'm speechless when I get stories like that.
Because there's so much espionage that goes on, and we just, we hear stories like that, but there's an undercurrent of the espionage between all these countries, and then the underground organizations that are still alive and working in a lot of these countries.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have got quite a number of interviews, well over, I would think probably about 150 with people from the US. And that does include people from the intelligence services. Interestingly, with the UK, I've got 0 with people from the intelligence services. They just don't want to go on the record, which is a shame, but it is what it is. And those are interesting stories. I interviewed a guy who was involved in the case of Ana Montes, who was, I think she was FBI and she was spying for the Cubans, and only recently got released and is now in Costa Rica, I think. That was really interesting because that showed some of the spy craft and how they were doing the surveillance and all that sort of side of things. And any episode I do that is espionage related normally gets more listens than the story of a factory worker from Gdansk, let's say, or something like that, which I think is a real shame because I think there's a richness in all of the stories. But I do quite often get comments where, look, I came for the spies and now I'm hooked on the other stories. And I think, hey, my job is done. That's what I want to do, is broaden people's knowledge of the Cold War, that it's not all James Bond, and the Berlin Wall and the DMZ and all of that sort of stuff. It's far more nuanced and far more complex.
And then, that story you told at the beginning about the young girl whose father was getting interrogated and for voicing his opinion and going against the regime. Those are the kind of stories that there's millions of them, and we just don't ever get to hear them. But then the espionage, we see so much in movies and things like that. They're so intriguing. And then you get to actually talk to these people that live that life. And that's what is so fascinating.
Yeah. I think probably the CIA one interview that stands out the most for me was with a woman called Marty Peterson. And she was the first female CIA officer deployed in Moscow. And the story starts with she's living with her husband in Southeast Asia. He's working for the CIA. And one night she hears a car on the drive, and it's one of her husband's friends to tell her that her husband's been killed in a helicopter crash.
Mm.
And when she tells that story, it's difficult because she's having to, relive that experience. But she then decides that she wants to work in the CIA. So she applies to join the CIA, and this is like the 1970s. So, you're gonna you're going to be a typist, you're going to be an admin, you're going to be this, that, and the other. But she insists that she wants to be operational. And what becomes apparent to the CIA is in Moscow, the women don't get followed because they just think the Americans would never dream of using a woman for, covert work, apparently. So she ends up in Moscow. She is working in an admin role by day, but by night she's working for the CIA. She's servicing dead drops. She's doing all sorts of stuff. At the embassy, she's known as Party Marty because she's always at all the parties and, appears to be this admin person who, likes a good time and stuff like that. And her colleagues have no idea that what she's up to. But unfortunately, at one point, one of the agents is betrayed, probably by Aldrich Ames or Hanson or one of those other US traitors. And so when she's servicing a dead drop and dropping off a package for the agent, she's captured by the KGB. She's taken to the Lubyanka, but because she is a diplomat, albeit spying, she has certain protections. So her boss in the admin department is called in, and he has no idea that she's CIA. And there's a great photo of him sitting next to her, and all this spying paraphernalia is laid on the table by the KGB, and he's looking like completely bemused as to, what's going on. But it's an incredible story and beautifully told. By Marty, and an indication there as to how far women's roles in the CIA have come from that point. She was a real pioneer there. And I've got a more recent interview with somebody who served in the CIA in the 1980s, who was deployed to Moscow. And as part of her training, she was given the option of being an operational CIA officer, and takes that role, undergoes paramilitary training and all sorts of things, and ends up serving in Moscow, doing a very similar role to what Marty was doing, but doesn't get caught.
Those are such interesting stories, and then to see how they live that life, and now they're back in a regular life, and are able to come and tell those stories to you, and then you have to think, those are the stories they're telling. What the stories do they have that they can't tell?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Mm.
I mean, with the woman Susan Miller, who I haven't published this interview yet, but she goes on to be field station head of CIA in Vilnius, just as the Soviet Union is disappearing. And one of her roles is to try and find if rogue nuclear weapons are being bought and sold, or try and stop them getting to terrorist organizations. And so they have some training as to how to identify one of these things. And a guy comes into the office one day with a lead lined box and says, "Look, I think you might be interested in this. I want to sell it." And she does all the checks on it and thinks, "God, this is enriched uranium in these jars, and it's sitting in her office." And so she calls her contact, who then says, "Right, I'm flying over straight away." And he comes over, he checks it out, he says, yeah, this is the real deal. And she says, well, what do I do with it? And they said, well, just keep it in the corner of your office somewhere until I get somebody to collect it. And she says, is there anything else you want me to do? And the guy says, yeah, just don't let it get wet. And she says, have you seen the ceiling in this place? It's like, we've got buckets, there's drips coming down everywhere. He says, well, I can't help you with that, but just don't get wet. Don't let it get wet. Yeah, she doesn't let it get wet, and it does get taken away. But it was incredible detail as to what Europe was like after the Soviet Union fell, and how some of these countries had to transition from being, state-owned organizations and all those sort of things, and set themselves up as a new country. Build banks and build an army and build a civil service. So some of my episodes do flow over into that post-Cold War period, because I think you just can't ignore it. You can't separate it out.
How do you think the horizon is now in our current environment? Are there a lot of undercurrents out there with a lot of spying and things like that by the Russians or by the others in these countries, trying to destabilize them?
I'd say without doubt. I mean, in the UK, we've had hard evidence and experience of that. We've had a nerve gas attack in Salisbury, whereby KGB agents were trying to assassinate a KGB defector, and used Novichok on the door handle of their front door to try and poison him. He survived the attempt, but they threw the bottle that they used to spray the door handle into a rubbish skip, and it was picked up by a bloke walking past thinking, oh, this looks like a perfume bottle, I'll give it to my wife.
Oh no.
And she sprayed it on herself, and she was killed. So this stuff is going on all the time, and it's not just the Russians, it's Chinese as well. And I have no doubt it is going on, and I think that's why, to some degree, some people are reticent about giving me too much information about intelligence, about some of their intelligence stories, because some of the techniques that were used in the 1980s and during the Cold War are still used today, and they don't want it being revealed.
Yeah, sounds like you get to hear a lot of really interesting stories, and makes me want to hear a lot of these more interesting stories, because we just don't hear a lot about it. And it makes me think, Rick, that we have a lot of Cold War veterans who don't think that anything that they experience matters because they weren't in an active war. And it makes me think we really need to kind of pull some more out of those guys, because I'll bet you they got some stories in there.
And they would be good candidates. They would be good candidates to come on Cold War Conversations with Ian and tell their stories.
I would absolutely welcome them on Cold War Conversations. I'm always looking for stories, and as you said there, I mean, I often get people, I'll approach them, and they'll say, well, who would be interested in hearing my story? And I said, 100,000 downloads a month would be interested in hearing your story. There's an audience out there, there's an appetite out there, and you will help to educate young people as to what the Cold War was really like. And that's probably the most important thing that I'm doing. That wasn't necessarily a primary motive for me at the start, but I think it's become more and more important the more that I've done this and spoken to teachers and spoken to educators as to the value of this archive that I've created. Rick's very kindly put the website address at the bottom of the page, so if you go there, you can access the entire archive. There's a search bar there, so you can search by topic or things like that. But if you want to share your story with me, then you can email me at Ian, that's IAN, at coldwarconversations.com, and I'd be very interested in hearing your stories.
Absolutely. And would you say that we had the Cold War and then it was kind of over, but it looks like that we're like in Cold War II now. I mean, we've got a lot of the similarities going on with the different countries.
There is. I mean, I rarely step too far into contemporary politics and on the podcast, but it's difficult to separate it out. I think because I was born in the year of the Cuban Missile Crisis, so 1962. So the Cold War was my formative years. Now, even at the darkest moments in the Cold War, there was not a war going on in Europe. There is a war going on in Europe at the moment in Ukraine. So I think it's a very volatile situation. There's always the argument from Putin that there was some sort of agreement that NATO wouldn't expand further east. My belief is there might have been some verbals around that, but certainly nothing was written down. No agreement was signed, and I don't see how you can let newly democratic states be forced to not be in control of how who they choose to be their allies. That would mean that we were just still consigning Eastern Europe to a Russian sphere of influence in the same way that the Soviet Union had it through the Cold War. So I have done one episode which is entitled the Cold War Origins of the War in Ukraine. So if people want to hear sort of my explanation around that, that's a really good episode to choose. It's an interview with an author who interviewed various people who were key figures during that period. Yeah, it's a really interesting episode. It opened my eyes to some things that I didn't know.
And you can find all these at coldwarconversations.com. And there's hundreds of them, and you've got them all cataloged into different categories. And I'm just anxious to get to start listening to these more and more to learn more about the Cold War that I grew up with and understand it more. And Ian, hopefully someday when you come to the U.S., that we can kind of coordinate a visit over here to where you could come to speak to our roll call group, because I know that it would be a very interesting topic for our veterans. And so that's something we can work on in the future. And if you come to the U.S. to speak or do research or whatever, maybe we can kind of dovetail that in and get you here to speak to our audience, our veterans.
That's very kind. That's a lovely invite. I would love to do that. I'm not sure how I'm going to be able to do that, but I'm delighted that you feel I'm worthy of an invite to speak in front of your veterans. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I know we want to get you hooked up with our Cold War veterans so you can get their stories too. So
yeah. And if you hook me up, because you mentioned you've got somebody there who's already recording some of their stories, so it'd be great to be in contact with them as well. So feel free to share my email.
Okay.
There as well.
Well, thank you very much for joining us, and it's a pleasure to meet you in person like this. We've corresponded over the course of the last few months, and hopefully you can get our friend John Yule on there. He's got remarkable stories, and he's a great American POW in the Vietnam War. And whenever his B-52 got shot down, it was only one of the few that got shot down where the entire crew survived. So he's just got some good stories. But thank you so much for giving us the honor of being on Hometown Heroes.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's been a delight talking to you and also talking to your audience. So look forward to receiving a few emails from people who want to share their stories.
Absolutely.
Send it out to our group.
Absolutely. And Mary and I will for sure be fans of Cold War conversations and start listening to that as we drive and listen to your podcast. So
thank you. That's worth it. Just picking up another 2 listeners. Fantastic.
two listeners at a time, and I'm sure there's more out there. So you're been a great guest today. I just thank you for the work you do preserving history.
I love it. That's why I do it. It's passion. If you've got a passion for something, that's why you do it. And it's important work as far as I'm concerned.
Very important. So thank you so much. And we look forward to really meeting you in person someday.
Okay. You're on.
Okay. Keep up the good work. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And you keep up your good work. It's incredible what you're doing for veterans over there. So appreciate that as well.
Well, thank you so much, Ian. God bless.
Hey, I found, I listen to podcasts on iHeartRadio, and you can find his podcast on iHeartRadio. So when I'm out walking, I listen to different podcasts. So that's good to know, so that I don't have to go add another service there. But and iHeartRadio is free, so for those out listening there, it's an easy one. You can get it, and then also get you in a routine of going out and walking and listening.
And learning a lot about the Cold War. That's, we have so many veterans that served during the Cold War. And I think sometimes the people, they say, oh, here's the veterans from World War II and Korea and Vietnam and Afghanistan and Iraq. But then we have the Cold War people stand up, and I think some people say, well, they didn't fight anymore, but there was a war going on, and it was because they were out there on the front lines. They kept it from coming in and being an actual war.
Right. There was a lot of stuff going on. It just wasn't the kind of stuff in what you're talking about in an actual declared war situation. But there was a lot going on.
Absolutely. And remember to go to coldwarconversations.com and be able to start listening to Ian's podcast. Well, we've had a busy week last week. We had roll call the other day.
Yeah.
And it was a good group, even though the weather was starting to change. We had a room full of people, and that was before the ice.
We signed up 5, so I added extra seats knowing that people were going to cancel because of the weather. So I let it bump up over 500. So I had it up to 503 RSVPs when people started canceling. And I had about 70 cancel. So I anticipate over the course of about 3 days that canceled because of weather or illness. So, but we're used to that. We have a lot of people that have to cancel because of illness or doctor's appointments. They didn't think that they were going to be able to get that sort of thing. And so it boiled down to, I thought, maybe 350 will show up. And we set up to be prepared for about 400. And we still had food planned because I'd already turned in numbers for 490. And I think we ended up with about 425 is what we ended up with.
Because we set up some extra tables. So.
Yeah, we had to set up some extra tables. That's right. So it was it was the first time that we had to do that, but people had a little extra space, and we have to make sure to tell them, don't get used to that, because next month we'll be back to being crammed in like sardines again.
And we had Manny Ramirez, County Commissioner. He came to visit us, and we had a couple of presentations, and one of them was a presentation from the Quilts of Valor, and presented it to me, and I just so grateful for Charcy Holler for putting my name in, and she actually did work on that quilt. She and the Daughters of the American Revolution, the chapter here, have been so supportive, as well as the other chapters, but they're so supportive of our veterans and do so many things. And that quilt came just at the right time. You know, I've used it extensively.
Right. I think it's neat how they made the point, because they did a presentation to you and to Kurt Tozel and to Jesus Villegas, which Jesus was from a different chapter, but the same people went ahead and did the presentation due to Charles C. having to be out of town. But they made the point of, these are not quilts that are to be looked at, to your point. These are quilts that are intended to be used. And if you noticed, Rick's always the guy behind the camera, so he never gets his picture taken and put on the thing. So I made sure to tape, and so I have video and I have photos from Rick being presented. I did the best I could. But that is on Facebook now, and you can see Rick's quilt. It's out there.
It's a beautiful quilt.
It is beautiful. And it's the way that they do the stitching to put your name and all that information in it. So it's not just like any other quilt somebody can go pick up and grab. That if you pick up that quilt and you open to that flap, you can see the information where your name and your service is included. And that was priceless. So we had the Gold Star Mom, Carla Wicks, being presented with a flag to fly, not to be put in a case, but to be flown, with her son's name on it by the Honor and Serve, and then the 3 presentations. And we've never had that before. So I thought it was going to be kind of neat to get the veterans to see these presentations that we've not been part of before. So hopefully we'll do more Quilts of Valor presentations in the future, because we certainly have a lot of veterans who I think would be honored to receive those.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, you talk about Kurt, and he received one, and, he was a pilot in the Air Force, and he had about 4 tours in Vietnam. So I've been talking to him about being on our podcast to tell some of the things that he's done during his career. Well, the other day, whenever they honored me with that quilt, I said, one of the greatest honors of serving our country was to be able to claim the title as a veteran. And, you look at on all our veterans, and we all can claim that title. And, it's so nice that we have places like Roll Call that honor our veterans, and these other organizations that do so much for our veteran community. It's such a blessing.
Yeah.
And speaking of that, Monday, February the 2nd, is Military Appreciation Day at the Fort Worth Stock Show and Rodeo. Woo! And it's going to be a good day. We're going to have the Manny Ramirez, the county commissioner, sponsors the Veteran Expo. And that does it start about noon or something like that?
I'm pretty sure it's at noon to 4. I think you may be able to get in there a little bit earlier, because you're going to want to get in there and get your ticket for your lunch.
Absolutely. And they're going to give a $20 voucher, I think, this time. It's been $10, which is better than nothing. But $20 will get you a lunch next door at the Roundup Inn. And you can go rollcall.org and find out more information about that. There's going to be free parking, but you have to use a certain parking garage, and then free admission to the grounds. Right. I know some of our veterans have gotten rodeo tickets, so that night we're going to have military appreciation night at the rodeo, and the Air Power Foundation is going to gift 2 service dogs, and then after the rodeo, there's a after party at the Ultra Roadhouse just right outside the east doors. And Kirk House, a great supporter of our veterans, is going to have a concert. So, and that's free. So,
Yeah.
a lot of stuff going on.
Yeah, and if to get that free parking though, you have to do the pre-registration, because that way then they can send you the information that you need to get the free parking. So if you just go out to the internet and Google Tarrant County Salutes Veterans, that will bring you to the page where you can register in advance. Now you can register at the door from 9 until noon is registration, but that won't include free parking. The doors will open at 12 and it runs till 6 in the Amon G. Carter Jr. Exhibit Hall. So just good information for you to get out there and look at. But pre-register. That gets you the free lunch and the free parking.
And it might get you entered in some of the door prizes, you think?
Yep. If you're registered, you get entered in for the door prizes. And I think you got a pretty good one last year.
I got a real good one. Our friends at Light Up to Live, they had a door prize, and that was a light system for therapeutic things like knees and backs and nerve damage and things like that. So it's for an old man with a lot of
A lot of aches and pains.
a lot of mileage, high mileage. Well, there's a lot of aches and pains, and that helps a lot. So just a shout out to our friends at Light Up to Live, Randall Reed, and
doing great work.
Do absolutely fantastic work. And the rodeo will be great. I've been to a lot of the rodeos so far this season. I've had to miss a couple because of the ice, but I should be back in the rodeo tonight, and look forward to a lot more of the bull riding and all the things they do at the rodeo. So this month, roll call. What is it? Who's on our? Who's our speaker this month?
So Michael Johnson, who we had on, Army Ranger, who we've had on the podcast, who has an incredibly interesting story. He will be our speaker, and that's the luncheon is February 27th. The RSVPs will open on the 16th. And if it goes the way that it did this month, they will be filled on the 16th. So I tell everybody, even if you don't get the email or you're not yet a member of Roll Call, so you're not getting emails from us, just go to our website at roll-call.org. Don't forget the dash, because without it, you're going to, who knows what, there's all kinds of other roll call things out there, and they're not us. But go to that website on the 16th of February and do your RSVP, because otherwise, if you wait till the next day even, it's already full. So we are hoping to work out with the help of some our wonderful sponsor, Mike Reppert of Spectrum Advisors. We are going to hopefully work out something with the pastor to maybe be able to up the numbers by using the upstairs, but that's more to come on that. So we'll work that.
There's Mike's website, spectrumadvisors.net. What a great organization, and a great person, because he has invested so much through Paul to Roll Call. So thank you so much, Mike. Well, it's been a very interesting podcast today, and I look forward to learning a lot more about the Cold War. And it's just intriguing, the things that went on. And so I just thank Ian for being a guest today from England. And, that's the cool thing about this technology, is because that's second or third time we've done some from from France and from England and Hawaii and different places around the world. So I love that technology. Well, thank everybody for being on here today and sharing with us and watching the podcast, and we just hope that everybody down here in the ice belt of Texas stay safe.
Ready for it to melt.
I am too. I've got cabin fever. I'm going to try to get out in just a little bit. So hopefully I won't. The problem I have is just the fear of slipping and falling because I don't bounce anymore. So, Mary, thank you so much for being here, and we'll see you next week on Hometown Heroes.